You're standing outside a country club in Nashville on a Saturday afternoon, in a dress you changed into 4 times before you got it right, and your hands won't stop shaking, because behind every single thing happening inside that building sits $30,000 of your own money. Not borrowed, not charged, yours. Every penny you saved over 2 years. Pulled from your salary as an administrative coordinator at Vanderbilt Medical Center. Every weekend shift you picked up. Every vacation you postponed. Your signature is on the venue contract. Your name is on the catering invoice, the florist's paperwork, the cake order, the linens, the chairs that nobody will remember by next week anyway. You didn't ask for recognition. You didn't ask to be thanked in a speech or mentioned in the program. You just wanted to sit somewhere in the back of that room and watch your little brother marry a woman he said was the one he loved since the moment he met her. That was all you wanted. Then she walked up to you in front of the other guests, in front of your own mother, and your mother looked directly at you and said it. You don't belong here. She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull you aside. She said it out loud like it was the simplest fact in the world, and your little brother Marcus stood 3 feet away and said absolutely nothing in your defense. He looked at his shoes. Nothing. You didn't cry. You didn't make a scene the way your mother always expected you to make scenes when you were upset. You just walked to your car in that dress you'd spent an hour trying to get right, sat down in the driver's seat, closed the door, and opened your phone. Within 10 minutes, you had called every single vendor tied to that wedding. My name is Marcus, and I need to pause here because I want you to understand something before we go any further. This isn't just a story about a woman who got angry at her family. This is a story about what happens when someone finally stops apologizing for taking up space. So much of this story is going to feel raw because it's supposed to feel raw. It is raw. Let me tell you who you are before the country club. Let me tell you who you've been your whole life. You're the one who keeps the peace. You're the one who remembers everyone's birthday even when they forget yours. You're the one who knows how to fix things when they break, not just the broken things around the house, but the broken people at the table too. You learned very early that your job in this family wasn't to be celebrated. Your job was to be reliable. Your job was to disappear into the background, while other people took up all the space and light and forgiveness. When you were 9 years old, your mother brought your baby brother home from the hospital, and something shifted in your house that you didn't have words for until you were much older. Your brother wasn't especially talented. He wasn't especially kind. But he was charming in the way some people are charming, the way that makes you want to give him things just to see him smile. Your parents had the same line ready every single time he broke something, forgot something, failed something. He's just a boy, Marcus. Let him be. And you learned that you weren't just a boy. You were older. You were supposed to know better. That phrase became the architecture of your entire childhood. You gave him the last cookie every time, even though you were still hungry. You gave him the bigger half of your apologies, even when he was the one who'd messed up. You stayed quiet in rooms where you should have spoken up because drawing attention to yourself felt dangerous, like you might upset the balance your family had come to depend on. Your mother needed you to be solid. Your father needed you to be dependable. Your brother needed you to be the person who didn't need anything back. By high school, the gap between how you were treated and how your brother was treated had become impossible to ignore. You graduated with a 3.9 gigapascals and a full scholarship to Belmont University, and your parents barely showed up to your graduation ceremony. Your father said he had to work. Your mother said she had a migraine. Your brother had a basketball game that nobody really cared about anyway, but that's where they went instead. You sat in your cap and gown in the gymnasium bleachers with strangers around you, and you told yourself it didn't matter. It mattered more than you've ever admitted out loud. You went to college alone, no parents in the stands, no one sending care packages, and you worked 2 part-time jobs while carrying a full course load because nobody in your family offered to help. You learned that being reliable meant being invisible, and somewhere in that lesson, you decided you'd rather be invisible than risk being left behind again. So you built your own life. Medical administration coordinator at one of the most prestigious medical centers in Tennessee. An apartment in East Nashville with original hardwood floors and a garden you'd planted yourself. A 401k. A savings account that was more than just survival money. Your brother, meanwhile, dropped out of college because it wasn't his thing, and your parents didn't ask a single follow-up question. He wrecked his car, and your father wired him $5,000, without even asking why. You had already figured out why you were never offered that kind of help. It wasn't that your parents didn't have money. It was that you were the one they never had to worry about. And somewhere along the way, you understood something that nobody ever said out loud. Being reliable wasn't something you got celebrated for. It made you forgettable. Even when you finally fell in love with someone named David, even when you built something real and good with him for 3 years, he eventually told you that you were wonderful, just not exciting. He said it like he was apologizing, and it landed exactly the way these things always landed, like confirmation of something you'd suspected your whole life. That giving everything and asking for nothing doesn't make you lovable. It makes you forgettable. Still, when your brother called you 6 months later and told you he'd met Diana at a wedding venue she worked for, you tried to be happy for him. You genuinely tried. Diana worked in event coordination, always looked polished, always had her phone out. When you met her for the first time at a coffee shop in Green Hills, she smiled at you, but her eyes swept over you like you were pricing furniture at an estate sale. When Marcus and Diana got engaged after only 8 months of dating, and they admitted the wedding they wanted was way beyond what they could afford, you didn't hesitate. You told them to let you handle it. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the photographer, the cake, all of it, your gift to them. Marcus cried actual tears when you offered. Your mother called you generous. For the first time in your life, you felt like you'd stepped inside the circle instead of watching it from the outside, pressing your face against the glass. You should have remembered that in your family, generosity was never returned. It was expected, and love went to whoever demanded it the loudest. You were careful, though. A lifetime of being overlooked teaches you to protect yourself. You signed every contract yourself, you paid every deposit yourself, and you had your lawyer add a clause to each agreement. No transfers, no third-party changes without your explicit written approval. Because you weren't naive. You just wanted to make sure that if something went wrong, the choice to dismantle everything would belong to you. A week later, Diana called you and asked, sweetly, almost too sweetly, if you would be her maid of honor. You said yes immediately, and threw yourself into the role completely. Spreadsheets. Pinterest mood boards. You paid for a professional makeup trial for the entire bridal party at an upscale salon on Broadway. Diana barely responded to any of it, and worse, you kept discovering she'd already made decisions behind your back. She'd changed the photographer without telling you. She'd shifted the color scheme from lilac to pale blush, and nobody had bothered to give you a heads up. When you dropped by their apartment unannounced one Tuesday afternoon with fabric swatches, Marcus hesitated just a half-second too long before opening the door. Diana muted a video call and stood up too fast, too bright. Her smile practiced. You felt something shifting slow and cold inside your chest, like a door closing while you were still standing in the room. Something was wrong. You could feel it in the air. You asked them both to meet you for coffee that following Saturday, and you asked plainly if something was bothering them. Diana told you that wedding planning was stressful and you shouldn't take anything personally. Marcus told you not to worry, that you'd already done more than enough. You drove home with a heaviness in your chest you couldn't name, and that night you lay awake wondering what you'd done wrong. Because you always did this. You found a way to blame yourself first. A week later, you found out why. Diana posted a photo on Instagram. Her arm around another woman. A woman you'd never met, captioned, "My maid of honor. Couldn't imagine this day without you." No warning, no text, no explanation. You'd simply been erased from your own story. You sat on your couch and watched the comments pour in. Strangers congratulating a woman whose name you didn't even know for a title that had belonged to you 3 days earlier. You wanted to comment. You wanted to explain. You wanted to make everyone see what you had done, how much you had given. But instead, you just sat there scrolling through your own erasure. When you called Marcus, he told you almost casually that Diana wanted her maid of honor to be someone who felt like a real best friend, not just family. But you were still invited, he said. You still had a seat. That word seat rang in your ears for the rest of the night. A seat. Not the seat of honor. Not the seat at the table. Just a seat. One of many. Interchangeable. Forgettable. When you told your mother the next day, you were hoping for something. Some acknowledgement that this was unkind. Some recognition that you had been wronged. She didn't even look up from the magazine she was reading. "Don't make this about you," she said. "It's her big day. Just let it go." That was the moment you understood fully and finally that your job in this family had always been to give without complaint and disappear without being thanked. And you were tired. So tired. 3 days later, an old friend named Suzanne called you, and her voice sounded strange, hesitant, apologetic. She'd seen Diana's Instagram post, and something had clicked for her. "Did you remember David, the man you dated for 3 years before he ended things without warning, claiming he'd just fallen out of love?" Your stomach dropped before she even finished the sentence. Suzanne had run into David at a coffee shop about 2 weeks after you two broke up. He was with a woman, someone Suzanne had remembered as being polished and always on her phone. She hadn't made the connection until she saw Diana's wedding photos online. The woman was the same one, Diana. Your ex's new girlfriend. Possibly his current girlfriend. Maybe his. Something. Your mind flooded with details you'd buried. David's sudden secrecy. The notifications on his phone you never recognized. The strange composure Diana always carried like armor. The way she'd known your story but never told you about her connection to your ex. She hadn't just cut you from the wedding out of preference. She hadn't just decided she wanted someone else beside her. She had known exactly who you were from the very beginning. She had let Marcus introduce you. She had let you fund her entire wedding while sitting on that knowledge the whole time. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't a simple personality conflict. This was calculated. This was deliberate. And once you understood that, something inside you changed. You stopped being hurt and started being very, very clear-headed. The morning of the wedding, a text came through from Diana's number, dressed in polite language that couldn't hide what it actually was. After discussion, she and Marcus had decided to keep the wedding small. No extended family, and they hoped you'd understand. Understand. You texted Marcus directly. "Is this true?" The message showed as read. No response. Diana texted again. "Please don't bring unnecessary stress to the day. It's important to us." You stared at that text for a very long time. And then you typed 5 words. "Then I'll play my part." You hung up the phone, poured yourself a cup of coffee, made it strong, made it the way you liked it, and pulled out the folder you'd been building over 6 months of planning. Every invoice, every contract, every deposit. All of it in your name and no one else's. The protection clause your lawyer had insisted on now made perfect sense. You called the venue first and canceled, calmly, professionally. You identified yourself as the sole contract holder and instructed that no one else was authorized to make changes to the reservation. No third-party modifications. Everything stays locked. Then the caterer. Then the florist. Then the rental company with all the tables and chairs that nobody would remember anyway. Then the photographer. Then the bakery with the $4,000 custom cake Diana had chosen. And here's what you want to understand. You didn't scream when you made those calls. You didn't rage. You didn't explain or justify. You simply stated facts. Your name. Your authority. Your withdrawal. By early afternoon, everything Diana and Marcus had spent months curating had been quietly, surgically dismantled. Not out of rage, but out of the simple fact that it was never actually theirs to keep. Think about that for a moment. Because I want to know, if you were in her position, if you'd spent your own money, your own time, your own emotional labor on something for family, and they told you that you didn't belong there, what would you have done? I'm not asking what you should have done. I'm asking what you would have actually done, in that moment, with $30,000 of your own money sitting on the line and nobody defending you. Would you have just absorbed it? Would you have smiled and pretended? Or would you have understood that sometimes the only language people listen to is consequence? The night before the wedding, your phone stayed completely silent. You weren't expecting calls. You understood that silence wasn't peace. It was ignorance. They still didn't know. Marcus and Diana were probably still asleep, still thinking that tomorrow morning they'd walk into a country club and see the wedding they'd been planning for 6 months. Marcus found out first. He showed up at the locked gate of the venue that Saturday morning and was met by a confused groundskeeper who told him the reservation had been canceled. Days ago. No tents, no setup, no trucks, no flowers, nothing. When Marcus called Diana, you could almost hear the scream through your phone even though it was across town. He was calling you next, but you didn't answer. You didn't need to know what he wanted to say. You already knew. Your mother called you 2 hours later, panicked, asking what you had done. Her voice was shaking. This was supposed to be one of the most important days in their lives, and it was falling apart. You told her evenly to ask the people she'd chosen to defend instead of you. She threatened legal action. She told you that Marcus's lawyer cousin, a man you'd never met, claimed you could be held liable for damages, that you could be sued for sabotage or breach of goodwill or something equally absurd. You told her you just emailed her the contracts. Every single one, all in your name, never transferred, never modified by any third party, because nobody had ever bothered to ask permission. They tried to cut me out of my own investment, you said quietly. So I withdrew it. Guests were flying into Nashville from 6 different states for a wedding that no longer had a venue or a cake or flowers. Parents were driving through the night. Uncles were taking vacation days. And there was nothing left for anyone to do but live with the consequences of a choice they'd made when they decided you didn't belong. The courthouse ceremony happened 2 days later on a Monday morning. Folding metal chairs, fluorescent lights, the clinical smell of government buildings, the vast distance between what Diana had imagined and what actually happened, was written all over her face. Her hair was pinned up hastily. Her makeup was rushed. Her smile when she looked at Marcus was forced, like something she was performing rather than feeling. Marcus looked pale. He looked like a man who had learned something about himself that he couldn't unlearn. Somewhere in those 48 hours, he'd figured out what you'd figured out much faster. Diana had used him. She'd used your money. She'd used your labor and your love and your trust, and then she'd humiliated you in front of your family because she knew you well enough to understand that you wouldn't make a scene. And honestly, here's what I want to be honest with you about. I don't know if I could have stayed calm the way you stayed calm. I don't know if I could have made those phone calls without screaming. I don't know if I would have had the discipline to dismantle something with such precision when every part of me wanted to just blow it all up and burn it down. There's a kind of power in what you did. A quiet, methodical power that takes a specific kind of strength. About halfway through the ceremony, your 72-year-old Aunt Cheryl stood up from the second row without raising her voice. She didn't yell. She didn't make a scene. She just stood up and asked the room plainly if nobody was going to say anything about what had happened. She told them she'd postponed hip surgery for this wedding. She'd bought a new dress. She'd booked a hotel and rearranged her entire life. And now they were all sitting in a courthouse, because the bride and groom couldn't manage basic decency toward the woman who had paid for everything. The room went still. You didn't add a single word. You didn't need to. The silence that followed said more than any speech could have possibly said. A teenage cousin had filmed the whole exchange on his phone. By the following week, it had been watched by 3 million people online. Your aunt's voice ringing out clearly over shaky video footage while Diana's face crumpled and Marcus stared at his shoes. The comments were unanimous and, honestly, merciless in your favor. People called Diana manipulative. People called Marcus a coward. People called your mother cruel. Diana's social media turned into a battlefield until she made everything private, but the internet had already kept its receipts. By Thursday of that week, Marcus had stopped showing up to work. You didn't say anything publicly the entire time. You didn't post follow-up videos or defend yourself in comments. You didn't need to. The truth had already done that on its own. And that's something I want you to really sit with. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing. Sometimes the most powerful thing is to just let the consequences speak. A month later, Marcus showed up at your door on a rainy Tuesday evening. He was soaked through his jacket. He looked smaller than you remembered him being. He told you that you'd been right about everything. He told you that Diana had called you cold and controlling from the very start. She'd asked him to keep you out of smaller gatherings, to separate you from the family events, to slowly cut you off without making it look deliberate. He'd been too afraid of losing her to push back. He'd prioritized her comfort over his sister, over the person who had given him everything. And then he told you something else. He'd seen a message on Diana's tablet. It was still open, still warm with her presence. Someone named David was messaging her. A David who was telling her he was the only one who really understood her. A David who said their connection was the only real thing in his life. Marcus asked you plainly if you would have married Diana anyway if you'd known all of this. If you'd known about David, about the manipulation, about the calculated erasure. Marcus didn't answer. He told you he hadn't come to be forgiven. He'd come to tell you the truth out loud before you heard it from someone else, and then he left. There's a question buried in that story, and I want to ask it out loud. At what point does loyalty stop being loyalty and start being self-abandonment? At what point does family stop being family and start being a group of people who have simply become comfortable with your pain? Because that's what this story is really about. It's not about revenge. It's about recognizing the moment when you finally matter enough to yourself to say no. You had coffee with Suzanne a few days later, and you told her the truth as clearly as you understood it yourself. You hadn't canceled that wedding because you were angry. You'd canceled it because nobody had bothered to ask you why you'd walked away. They had simply assumed you would absorb it the way you always had. They thought your love and your money were infinite resources that they could draw from without consequence. They thought you'd show up anyway, smile anyway, perform gratitude anyway. And you finally decided that you were done. When your mother texted a few weeks later asking for dinner, just the three of you, something in you understood immediately what that dinner would actually cost. It would come with an unspoken bill, your silence, in exchange for a seat at a table you'd spent your whole life trying to earn. Your emotional labor, in exchange for the illusion of belonging. You read the text once. You set the phone down without replying. You didn't block her. You didn't make an announcement about it. You just didn't respond. And that was its own kind of answer. That evening, you drove out to a quiet park at the edge of Nashville and walked the trails without any particular destination. You could hear children laughing somewhere in the distance. You watched the light turn gold through the trees as the sun moved lower. And standing there in that quiet, ordinary evening, something shifted inside you. For years you had tried to be the daughter, the sister, the woman your family had already decided you were allowed to be. Standing there in that golden light, you understood something you hadn't let yourself believe before. You had never been the problem. You didn't need anyone's dinner invitation to prove that you belonged to yourself. And for the first time in your life, that was enough. If you've ever been in a room where someone looked right through you like you were furniture, like your presence was an inconvenience, like you were taking up space that belonged to someone more important, this story is for you. If you've ever given everything quietly and received nothing in return, if you've ever made peace with invisibility because it felt safer than demanding to be seen, if you've ever told yourself that the people closest to you were worth the pain of being overlooked, I want you to know, you matter. Not because someone finally recognized it, not because you proved it to them, not because they eventually apologized or understood. You matter because you exist. Full stop. The mistake most people make is waiting for someone else to give them permission to matter. They wait for the family dinner invitation. They wait for the thank you speech. They wait for the moment when everyone finally sees what they've done and loves them for it. But here's what I know now. That moment rarely comes. And even when it does, it's never quite enough to fill the hole that was left while you were waiting. What you learned, what I think this entire story teaches us, is that your worth is not contingent on anyone else's recognition. Your value doesn't increase when your family notices you. It doesn't decrease when they dismiss you. You are exactly as worthy at your lowest point as you are at your highest. The only question is whether you're ready to believe it. So here's what I want you to do today. Find something in your life where you've been shrinking yourself to fit someone else's comfort. Find where you've been making yourself smaller, quieter, less demanding. Find that place. And ask yourself one hard question. Is this serving me, or is this serving them? Because once you start asking that question, you can't stop. And once you stop making excuses for people who treat you as an afterthought, everything changes. I want to know what you think. Do you believe that Marcus was right to come to you after everything? Or do you think some silences should stay silent? Comment 1 if you think he deserved forgiveness. Comment 2 if you think he forfeited that right the moment he stood quiet while his mother humiliated you. Or comment 3 if you think forgiveness isn't even the point is just finally choosing yourself. Tell me where you're watching this from right now. What city? What time is it where you are? I love connecting with stories from all over the world, and I want to know who's out there listening to this, and thinking about the people in their own life who maybe don't deserve as much grace as they've been getting. And finally, have you ever had a moment like this? Not exactly like this, but that same moment where you realized someone was never going to give you what you were hoping for, and you had to decide to stop asking? I'd love to hear those stories. The internet is full of people who need to hear that they're not alone in understanding what it feels like to be the reliable one, the invisible one, the one who shows up over and over to people who forgot to show up for you. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe. There are more stories coming. Stories about people finding their power in quiet moments, stories about families and betrayal, and the slow realization that you've been loving people who were never quite ready to love you back. More stories are coming your way soon. Until next time, stay kind to yourself, because you might be the only person in your life who remembers to be. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Nashville, Tennessee, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.